Good evening. On behalf of the Grant Monument Association, welcome to this special online program to mark President Ulysses S. Grant's 199th birthday. By way of introduction, the Grant Monument Association, or GMA, is a nonprofit that was organized during the 1990s as the successor to the organization of the same name that originally built and administered Grant's tomb in New York City until it was transferred to the National Park Service. The GMA is dedicated to the preservation of Grant's tomb, which is the largest mausoleum in the Western Hemisphere. An important part of our mission is to foster education about the life and legacy of General Grant, the principal author of Union victory during the Civil War and our nation's 18th president. The GMA's tradition in recent years has been to commemorate Grant's birthday with a dinner in New York City, highlighted by a colloquy in which General David Petraeus, an honorary member of our board, interviews a historian about different aspects of Grant's story. Because of the ongoing pandemic, for the second year in a row, we have had to cancel the dinner, but we are glad we can come together online to observe Grant's birthday today with a colloquy we can bring to you at home. For those of you joining us for the first time, we encourage you to check out the Grant Monument Association's website at grantstomb.org to learn more about the story behind the monument and how you can help in its preservation. And we hope that next year we can get together in person to mark President Grant's 200th birthday. Between now and then, please keep checking our website for notifications about Grant bicentennial programs as they are scheduled. Before I turn this over to our guests, I would like to thank the KKR Global Institute, which is chaired by General Petraeus, for providing us technical assistance for tonight. And a special thank you to the National Park Service Rangers and volunteers who are caretakers of the tomb and who are sharing this program with their audience on social media. Every year, the Park Service hosts an official Grant birthday observance at Grant's tomb with the participation of the United States Military Academy at West Point. And they did that online this year since Grant's tomb is still closed to the public. The three participants in tonight's program have among them over a century of accumulated service in the United States Army. They also share a special connection to West Point, the alma mater of General Grant, along with so many of America's most accomplished military leaders, including our own General Petraeus. Joining the General tonight are two special guests. Brigadier General Ty Seidule is a graduate of Washington and Lee University who received his PhD from Ohio State University. He is the former head of the history department at West Point and a distinguished author and commentator on the Civil War and historical memory. His commentary for PragerU, entitled "Was the Civil War About Slavery?" received over 2.7 million views on YouTube. Among his many publications, General Seidule co-edited the award-winning 4-volume West Point History of Warfare, and this year he published Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause. Also joining us is Major General Dana Pittard, a graduate of West Point who received his master's degree from the School of Advanced Military Studies at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He was also a senior fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. General Pittard is a highly decorated combat leader and commander who in 2014 led the initial U.S. response to halt the spread of ISIS in Iraq. He is the co-author of the book Hunting the Caliphate, America's War on ISIS, and a distinguished commentator on topics ranging from defense policy to race relations to veterans issues. Tonight's topic, Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. The epic contest between both men was one of the most consequential between any two commanders in military history. Both figures have seen dramatic changes to their historical reputations over time. We will hear tonight why that was the case and how Grant and Lee responded to the circumstances they faced in their shared time on the national stage during one of the most tumultuous and pivotal periods in American history. We very much appreciate all of tonight's speakers taking time out of their busy schedules to join us. And we thank all of you who are watching for joining us. I'll now turn the program over to General Petraeus. General?
Well, thanks very much for the kind introduction, Franks, and more importantly, thanks for your extraordinary leadership of this great organization over many years. And good evening to all who join us virtually for what promises to be a very stimulating event, an opportunity to discuss issues of history, racism, and dangerous myths of America's past, especially those perpetuated in the century following the Civil War. These issues are confronted head-on by Brigadier General Ty Seidule in his great new book, Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause. But rest assured, we'll also weave in questions about America's greatest wartime general, Ulysses S. Grant, as it is his birth on this day in 1822 that brings us all together. Beyond that, I'd like to think that Grant would approve of the discussion we will have this evening as we celebrate his 199th birthday. Robert E. Lee and Me is a truly thought-provoking book and a great one. After reading it, Ron Chernow, our guest of a couple of years ago, wrote, "In this fine book, Ty Seidule scorches us with the truth and rivets us with his fierce sense of moral urgency." I cannot think of a better book to enrich and invigorate our national discussion about race and memory and the troubled legacy of Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy. I agree with that assessment. And this evening, it's a privilege to discuss the issues that his book raises, not just with its author, but also with retired Major General Dana Pittard, who, as you heard, is a highly decorated combat commander who led a brigade in Iraq during my 3-star tour there, and years later led the initial response to the Islamic State in Iraq, having served as a young officer there in the Gulf War. Dana was one of the commanders I regarded most highly back in my day in uniform, and he has written and commented extensively, not just on the fight against ISIS, but also on race, diversity, and inclusion. I read Robert E. Lee and Me this past summer after Ty sent me a copy following publication of an essay I wrote for The Atlantic, advocating changes to the name of 10 U.S. Army forts that honor individuals who led Confederate forces against U.S. Army soldiers in the Civil War. I was very taken by Ty's manuscript, later describing it as a timely, powerful, and courageous book that takes readers on a fascinating intellectual journey, describing how Seidule's assessment of Robert E. Lee evolved over the years, from his childhood through his education, and then his service at military bases in the South, to his development as a historian who, as you heard, ultimately became the head of the U.S. Military Academy's History Department, and whose intellectual journey culminated with an incredibly forthright assessment of Lee in a speech at Seidule's alma mater, Washington and Lee University. This is a book that only a true Southerner and a true historian could have written. And with that, let's get started. Ty, again, congratulations on a great book. You're a historian, but you chose to write a book that is much memoir as it is history. Soldiers usually write memoirs, historians write history. You wrote both. A memoir that describes the long-term effects of the Civil War, but also a history of American racism. What led you to use your own story as the vehicle for describing these effects and history?
Sir, thank you so much for leading this discussion, and thank Dana for participating in the Grant Monument Association. It's my honor to be here on the 199th birthday of Grant. It's amazing. So I wrote this book because I was chair of the Memorialization Committee at West Point, and we wanted to honor the 100+ graduates who've been killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had no single place to do this. So we came up with an idea to create a new memorial room at West Point, which we'd never really had before. And the question became, who should go in there? Obviously, from the War of 1812 to the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan, and those who paid the last full measure of devotion. But should those who died for the Confederacy, who went to West Point, died for the Confederacy, go in? I argued stridently that they shouldn't, because they fought against their country to destroy the United States of America. They renounced their oath. They killed U.S. Army soldiers for the worst possible reason, to create a slave republic. And the building they were going into, Cullum Memorial Hall, actually was the money was given by an anti-Confederate who said we should never forget those who never forgive those who forgot the flag to follow false gods. So I gave this argument to our leadership, but they didn't see it that way. Despite my what I thought brilliant argument, wasn't the facts didn't work. So I lost, and in fact they were going to put the Confederate names in there. So I went home, tail between my legs. I talked to my wife, Sherry, and I said, I lost. I mean, I couldn't believe it. My well-honed historical argument didn't work. And she said, Ty, did you tell him why you're so passionate about this? And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, you grew up with this. Did you tell them why? I said, oh, no, I didn't. And she said, well, if you really want to have success changing people's minds about this, you've got to be honest about yourself. And so that's what I started to do. Rather than just be the know-it-all historian, I decided to tell my own story.
And you did brilliantly, I might add. I also might add that at the time that you did that assessment, I do not believe there was a monument to Grant at West Point. There were some buildings named for him, certainly, but not a monument until this organization, by the way, among others, provided the means to do that. And I believe it was 2 years ago that it was dedicated.
I was there, 2019. I was there. It was, there were tears in a lot of our eyes. It was amazing.
And we'll have more to say on that. Now, Dana, you were a military brat growing up, the son of a career soldier. Your story, though, couldn't be more different than Ty's. Can you give us an understanding of what it was like to grow up as an African-American and the son of a military man in the 1960s and 1970s, by which time segregation was illegal, but elements of it still remained?
First of all, really, I want to thank all of you. What an honor it is to be here on the 199th birthday of Ulysses S. Grant, born 1822. Yes, sir, I was a military brat. My father enlisted in the Army in 1950. Was still a segregated Army, even though it 2 years before that there had been the order, but it was a segregated Army and was just beginning to integrate. And the Army, in some ways, was dragging its feet. I was born in Japan in the late 1950s, and so was really raised on Army posts and Air Force bases in the 60s and early 70s. We moved around quite a bit, so got a feel for our nation, racism and other things throughout our nation when we moved. When we moved, we used what's known as the Green Book, which told us places that would not harass African Americans and we could stay. My father and mother also ensured that we avoided the South, no matter where we were going. We avoided the deep South when we would, go back to my mother's parents' home in Philadelphia. In fact, on one such trip, driving through Indiana, saw a cross burning in a field, a horrific sight for myself, my brother, two little boys at the age of 6 and 8 to see. And continue to drive. My father also put his Army service cap. Like he said, he enlisted in 1950, went to Officer Kennedy School. And so in the 60s, when he was a captain, major, and lieutenant colonel, he would put his service cap in the back window of our car so that we wouldn't be harassed as much by the police, depending on the state. And most of the time it worked, sometimes it didn't. Racism that I saw was usually off post or off base. On base, treated just like anyone else, but it was off post at schools where there was key differences. I remember one experience in Oregon where there only a few of us were African Americans from the Air Force Base we were living at the time. And it was an horrific experience, very traumatic. I was always told to stand up and for myself, and I did, but from day one was called names every day, almost throughout that entire school year. So again, that was an experience, but that's America at that time in the 1960s.
A full century after Grant defeated the Confederates who were fighting to preserve the vestiges of that kind of social situation. Now, Ty, you grew up in the opposite, a privileged white world. The title of your book mentions the lost cause of the Confederacy myth, and you refer to the lost cause repeatedly in your book. During my history courses in West Point, no one ever mentioned the lost cause myth. In fact, our military history course had nothing but praise for the tactical prowess of Lee and his comrades in the Confederate forces. That changed over time, of course, including when you were the head of the department. But tell us what this lost cause is all about.
Well, sir, if you think that the South went to war to protect and expand slavery, and they wanted to make that slave empire go into Mexico, California, Latin America, Caribbean, South America, that's what they wanted to do. They sowed the wind, they reaped the whirlwind. They lost 60% of the value of everything. The South lay in ruins, and this secessionist movement was dead. How could they deal with this horrific, terrible, I mean, it was a mistake, isn't it, this catastrophe? And so they created a way of looking at the war that made them look better and that reinforced white political power. So the elements of it are pretty straightforward. One, the war was fought over states' rights, not slavery. Well, that's just not true. Read the secession documents. It's absolutely they went to war to protect slavery. Enslaved people were happy, and it's the best labor system. This is what Jefferson Davis says after the war. Of course, that's monstrous. Slavery was the great evil of American history. The U.S. won because it had more manpower and materiel. Well, that's too easy. Grant had to go down and, in fact, capture 3 different armies and had to defeat, and he didn't just defeat, he destroyed 3 Confederate armies. All the South had to do was not lose, and they would have been victorious. So that's too easy. A part of it was that Reconstruction was an evil failure because Black people were ready for the vote. That's also wrong. It was our best chance at a biracial democracy. And we come out with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, much of that, and the civil rights legislations and the KKK Act, all of these done by Grant. So it was a promising time that eventually failed, but it was not a fail. It wasn't a failure because Black people weren't ready for it. Part of it was that Grant was a butcher and a drunk. Well, we know that's absolute. I don't have to tell this audience that that's not true. Greatest soldier that ever wore Army blue. And that Lee was at the top of this as the marble man, the greatest soldier, the greatest man who ever lived. And this is important because the lost cause myth really it is part of a pillar of that's the ideology, along with segregation laws, Jim Crow, along with white terror, lynching, along with Black disenfranchisement and Confederate monuments, that creates the pillars of a white supremacist society to enforce white political power at the expense of Black people. So that's what the lost cause is and why it matters.
Of course, Grant was characteristically clear in his memoirs when he described with words to this effect: the cause of the Confederacy as the worst for which a war was ever fought. And unfortunately, of course, the whole lost cause myth tried to undo that particular description. Staying with you, Ty, you explained that you grew up with this reverential view of Robert E. Lee. Can you provide a few examples of how you saw Lee honored and admired in your life?
Well, I would say that I grew up Episcopalian. I grew up on an Episcopalian school where my dad was a coach and teacher, but I went to church every Sunday. I was an acolyte. But if you had to ask me on a scale of 1 to 10, what would Lee go? I would put Lee at 11, and Jesus would come in at the 4, 5, 6 range. It was a reverential view. And I've got my little prop here, which is my Meet Robert E. Lee book, which was my first chapter book. You can see the Confederate flag there, and it's a little step up lion here, if you can see him there. That was the book that I read over and over again, where Lee is this great hero, was against slavery. It was the war between the states. In the 6th grade in Alexandria, Virginia, where I was born, I was bused across town from a white elementary school named after Douglas MacArthur, West Point graduate, to the segregated all-Black school named in 1961. And what was the name of that school? Robert E. Lee Elementary. And I was happy to go there because of that. So the white political culture, the white culture I was a part of, made him a reverential figure because of this lost cause myth. And because if you could love Lee, then the rest of this white power structure made sense. So yes, I grew up with a reverential view of Lee, both in Virginia and in Georgia, and when I went to school at Washington and Lee.
Now, for the audience, which we're gathered to celebrate Grant's birthday, what we're getting is an explanation of why Grant's reputation was so tarnished, was trashed. And by the way, the monument itself also deteriorated during this time until this organization, of course, saw to its restoration to the very impressive situation it's in today. But keep that in mind as we go through this, because it was this whole mythology that not only venerated Lee, but it also, of course, had to take the respectability of Grant away as well. Dana, you grew up understanding that the Confederacy meant something far different. Given your family schooling and reading, how did your parents and you see Lee and his cause?
Definitely, not only my parents, but the people that I knew at the time. I started reading about really history and military history in particular, really in the 4th grade, and always equated the Confederacy and the Confederate flag with evil. It was the same as a Nazi flag. They rebelled against our nation. They enslaved human beings. So it really represented evil. And in the same view, Ulysses S. Grant, General Ulysses S. Grant, as well as Abraham Lincoln, represented like the saviors, the people who helped save the Union. So always honored Ulysses S. Grant, even as a young boy. I mean, reading what is it, Stillness and Appomattox by Bruce Catton. I read that in the 5th grade. That's why I find it so hard to understand why grown people in the South could honor Robert E. Lee, who rebelled against our nation and everything our nation represented.
Now, Ty, you chose to go to college at Washington and Lee University. You write that you wanted to be a Virginia gentleman, like your idols, Washington and Lee. They were the 2 founders, after all, at least of that university. During your time there, you were an ROTC, you were commissioned as an officer in, of course, Lee Chapel. Your description of that ceremony borders on the surreal, and I'd ask that you describe it to the audience.
Yes, I wish I could say that I saw this evil earlier, but I didn't. I was at Washington Lee. I was a poor kid. My parents divorced while I was there. My dad's a teacher, mom's a nurse. So I took an ROTC scholarship only because I ran out of money. And 36 years later, I finally retired. It turned out to be a good choice. But I was there after graduation into Lee Chapel. And many of you may have been there before. But as you go in, it's a chapel, but there's no Christian iconography in there. There's no pulpit, no cross, no listing of the hymnals, nothing like that would be in a normal chapel. All there is a white slab, an altar. There's an apse of the chapel, a sanctuary. And at the apse of that chapel is a white marble table. But lying on top of the table is a statue of Robert E. Lee in repose. He's wearing his Confederate uniform with his right hand over his heart, left hand grabbing the scabbard of the sword, ready to rise up to fight for his people, for the people of the South, to fight for his social system, the social system of slavery. So I don't remember my graduation much, but I remember my commissioning. In my green uniform, I went up on stage. And as I went up on stage, I stopped. There's a picture of me there with my full head of hair, by the way. It was the 80s. We had long hair back then, and I was rocking it. Right next to this portrait of Lee. He looked resplendent in his gray with almost a halo of light around him. And then I went and got my commission surrounded by Confederate flags, the enemy's flags of the United States Army, and the enemy that killed more U.S. Army soldiers than any other enemy. And that's where I got my commission. Then I went back and sat down in the pews. And as I went back to sit down in the pews, I raised my right hand and gave the oath of office that General Petraeus has taken and given so many times, that General Pittard has given and taken so many times, that I administer to my son. That is the foundation of our service. I love that oath. That oath was written in 1862. It's an anti-Confederate oath. When it says that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Who are those foreign and domestic enemies? They're Confederates. When it says no purpose of evasion, that's to make sure that you're not a Confederate traitor trying to get into the United States Capitol or wherever it is. So I took an anti-Confederate oath surrounded by Confederate iconography. And it seemed normal to me. That's the crazy thing. It seemed normal to me because my culture made Lee an American hero, which he most certainly was not. It is Grant who was the hero, but it took me a long time to figure that out.
And that was 115 or 120 years after the end of the Civil War. Now, Danny, graduated from West Point, of course, and I'd like to ask you to describe the African-American cadet experience when you were there in the late 1970s and 1980s.
But overall, I felt like the experience was actually fairly positive. When I arrived at West Point in July 6, 1977, went through Lee Gate, along Lee Road. I noticed that it didn't. I just noticed that it didn't bother me at the time because I was focused on being a new cadet at the time, and so I didn't really dwell on that and didn't think much about that until really, I think, my junior and senior year, as to why there were such monuments to Confederates. Now there was Grant Hall, which I enjoyed going to, certainly. I never really felt any racism from my classmates. There was throughout the 4 years. It was 2 months before graduation, though. I had an incident where a classmate didn't know I overheard, but said the N-word about me. So that was a shock 2 months before graduation. But really, other than that, with my classmates, I was treated equally. You pulled your own weight, you did the jobs, and you led. From instructors, it varied, but for the most part, the instructors were very professional. And at that time, sponsors, white and black, but there was a unique kind of period there where there was this great number of African-American young officers who would later be general officers in our Army. Major Larry Ellis, Captain Larry Jordan, Captain Kip Ward, and others who were really great role models. So if there was anything, there was maybe some expectations, like it was just assumed that I couldn't swim. When my parents had a pool, I was a very good swimmer. I did laps, but there was an assumption that I couldn't swim, so I was put into the beginner swimming, and I quickly swam out of that, literally. But sometimes expectations, even the math instructor thought that I needed additional instruction before, as I walked into his class, and math was one of my favorite subjects. So just interesting. But the overall experience was in fact very, very positive. The social side was difficult. Upstate New York was different from what I was used to in far west Texas. So in many ways, we as cadets had to develop our own, or African-American cadets had to develop our own social system of bringing different dates, women into West Point, working with the hostesses and on our own on that. But overall, the experience was actually very positive.
Now, Ty, after graduation and commissioning, we both served at Fort Bragg and Fort Benning. I've visited most of the other 10 Army posts named for Confederate commanders. I really very seldom thought about the paradox of naming federal bases against those who led soldiers against federal forces. To me, the bases were places, not people. But on reflection, as I wrote in The Atlantic, those names do indeed represent people, leaders who fought against their country to preserve their state's rights to enslave others. So how did our Army end up honoring Confederate leaders by putting their names on federal Army bases?
It is an amazing thing that we've named these bases after the enemy. They were the enemy. And in fact, three people, Benning, Rucker, and Gordon never served in the U.S. Army. In fact, Gordon once gave a talk to Black Charlestonians after the war, 3 years after the war, and said, if you are to demand equality, we will start a race war, and the 40 million of us white people will exterminate the 4 million of you Black people in a race war. So we named these in World War I and World War II when the South was a racial police state. Our language matters here. Black people, starting in the 1890s, had been disenfranchised through violent terror and new constitutions that the Southern states put up. And so the Army represented that same racism. So, for instance, John Pershing, who commanded forces in France in World War I, when 5 of these bases were named, said that white troops should not ever eat or serve with or praise Black troops in any way. And so half of them were named then, and then the other half were named in World War II, when again, the South remained a racial police state and Black people did not have the vote. And part of it, I tried to figure out why. As I went through, I looked at the planners in the Army. And by that time, it was the Army War College, like the G5, the planners of the Army. And they did something called the Negro Manpower Study for 25 years, where they looked at the quote unquote problem that Black troops wouldn't fight, which is absolutely not true by the record. But they said that the reason that this was a problem, and I'm quoting here, is that the Negro is lower in scale of evolutionary development than the white. So the Army was racist. And for most of the US Army's existence, it was a segregationist organization. And so we can't understand the naming of those without understanding the context. The South was a racial police state. Politicians from the South were one party. They were all Democrats. They've been in office for 30, 40 years. They controlled all the levers of power. And the Army was segregationist as well. And so naming them after Confederates represents that portion of it. But the idea that we would name them for the enemy is still, to me, unbelievable.
Again, all part of the lost cause mythology, right, and perpetuation of that. Now, Dana, my recollection is that you may not have served at any of those 10 bases except for a course or two at Fort Benning, and maybe one at Fort Hood, where most officers of your branch armor, since it's the largest tank and mechanized infantry post, eventually do serve. How did that happen, and when did you recognize the bizarre reality that we were honoring those who led forces against our country to preserve their state's rights to enslave others by having their names on so many of our bases?
Well, some of that was from my father, because we moved around in the military, and he also avoided the Deep South. But what I guess I really woke up between my sophomore and junior year at West Point. I went down to airborne school at Fort Benning, Georgia, and we went to whatever it was, the welcome area, where you had to read about. And I always like, because I obviously majored in history, reading about Benning, General Benning. It's like, what? He was a Confederate? Absolutely was annoyed. In fact, disgusted is probably a better word for it. And then looking at the other posts that were named after Confederates. I mean, these were people who enslaved people like me. I mean, and our only crime is the color of our skin. So it made no sense to me. Now, looking at American history, there is some sense there, because we have a racist past. We're still to this day dealing with the legacy of systemic racism. But I absolutely stayed away from those posts. I had an opportunity for battalion command, a number of plush commands that were in the South, and I chose not to go. And it didn't hurt me, but I didn't know that at the time. But I decided to go to Fort Lewis, Washington, for brigade command. I had a choice. Could have gone to Fort Hood. I went to Germany. Again, staying away from the Deep South. I didn't want my family exposed to that either. That's just how I felt.
Oh, it's very understandable. Now, Ty, your epiphany came at West Point, where you were a history professor first, and ultimately the head of the department. I knew there were memorials to Lee there, but I never thought about how many actually until I read your book. As I recall, for example, on easy days as a cadet or professor there, when I was looking for a route that avoided big hills, I ran that route. You know the one, down Washington Road, right on Lee Road, past Beauregard Loop, through Lee housing area, and then turn around at Lee Gate to return. And at the library, as a cadet, I studied under a portrait of Lee in Confederate gray with an enslaved servant in the background. Beyond that, West Point still has Lee Barracks and a host of other memorials to the Confederate commander. And as I mentioned earlier, it had no monument to Grant till a few years ago. Yet despite all the honors to Lee around campus, it's at West Point that you began to understand the reality of the Southern cause and Lee's role in it. What happened while you were at West Point that changed your thinking, and what should be done about the recognition of Lee at West Point?
Sir, I've been in the Army for a while, and my identity now was historian and soldier, a soldier scholar rather than Southern gentleman. And I was walking one day when I got back there as a permanent professor, and I was living on Lee Road in Lee Gate by Lee Housing area, and I went by to get some swag for my family, past these barracks that are named for the greatest heroes in American history. There's Pershing, there's Eisenhower, then Pershing, then Grant, and then I stopped at Lee, and I just stopped and looked at that sign and said, wait a minute. Why are things named after Lee? And then I went running around and I found all these things named after Lee. And I said, why are there so many things at the United States Military Academy? I got it at Washington and Lee. I understood why. So I went to the archives. And then what I found just I could not believe it. So in the 19th century, nothing was named after Lee. West Point was an anti-Confederate monument. No Confederates buried in the cemetery. Battle Monument, our great monument on Trophy Point, 70 foot tall, is to the War of the Rebellion and those who fought and died for it. Cullum Hall, none in there as well. Even Duty, Honor, Country, our motto, was created in 1898, is anti-Confederate. So if that was the case, they didn't put Lee there right after the war. When did it come in? Well, that's what really, I couldn't believe it. It came in the 1930s. Why the 1930s? That's when Benjamin O. Davis Jr. and Black cadets come back for the first time in 50 years. They come in the 1950s. That's when the Confederate portrait of Lee in Confederate gray with an enslaved servant in the background comes. Why? Because the Army is fighting against integration that Truman has ordered from 1948, and it is fighting very hard against integration. Lee Barracks, named in 1970, the year after minority admissions brings from a couple of Black cadets to scores of Black cadets. So if you scratch a Confederate monument at West Point, it is a reaction against integration. And that led me into the archives even more to study the just awful purpose of the Confederacy. And what I realized is that they committed treason to preserve slavery. And once I figured that out, I'm slow. But once I figured that out, I had to tell others. I could not stop. And so that's when I really started doing it. So what should we do about this? I can't honor someone who committed treason to preserve slavery. So in my opinion, I've written this in many different aspects before, those monuments have to come down because history, we're still going to talk about the Battle of Chancellorsville at West Point, that Hooker's still going to lose. But commemoration should be who we value as a society. And I personally cannot value Robert E. Lee.
I think probably the only place that he should be left would be a photo of him or a picture of him when he was the superintendent, which would be an accurate depiction of history, but not honoring him certainly for what he did later on in his career. And that was a key question, by the way, from some in the audience prior to this. Ty, your final chapter is entitled My Verdict. Robert E. Lee committed treason to preserve slavery. Now, you know that I'm a Ulysses S. Grant man through and through. And after reading your book, I'm even more a fan of Grant because he's the opposite of Lee in so many ways. And I hope that those in the audience tonight will feel the same. But tell us why you find Lee such a problematic figure.
Yes, sir. Well, I love Grant too, and I've become more and more a fan of Grant over the years. But Lee chose treason to preserve slavery. Treason. There's only one crime in the Constitution, that is Article 3, Section 3, which says that treason is levying war against the United States. I think he absolutely did that. He became a colonel 2 weeks before he chose treason. So he took the oath of office just 2 or 3 weeks before he did that. Also, his biographer Freeman said that it was a choice he was born to make. Well, that's not true. There were 8 U.S. Army colonels from Virginia in 1861. 8. By the time Virginia seceded, 7 of them remained with the United States, and Lee and only Lee chose to go with the Confederacy, chose treason. Why? Well, the easiest reason is the reason the Confederates did, which is to preserve and protect and expand slavery. From late 1857 into early 1860, Lee spent 2.5 years running enslaved plantations for his father-in-law, and where he was seen as a cruel enslaver. He was the largest enslaver in the U.S. Army and benefited from it more than anyone else. He broke apart enslaved families while he was at Arlington. He ordered enslaved men and women whipped. But the bottom line is that he fought to create a slave republic. And I can't honor anyone who fought to create a slave republic and then killed U.S. Army soldiers. So yeah, I'm a Grant man through and through.
He certainly tried to rationalize it, as you know, but at the end of the day, I think your reasoning is correct. So having dealt with Lee now to a considerable degree, Grant's ultimate opponent, Ty, I've heard you say that U.S. Grant is the finest soldier who ever wore Army blue. That means greater than Ike, Marshall, Pershing, MacArthur, even Washington. Why do you see Grant as the best of all of them?
I tell you, Grant was at the place that we most needed. Could you imagine this country without Grant? The answer is no. It would have been a disaster. And it's really, I'm taking part of this from you, and you know that he, at the political level, he understood why this war was fought. It was fought because enslavers wanted to keep slaving, and he knew that he had to kill slavery to kill that. And he's used enslaved soldiers during the war. Strategically, he understood to hit the enemy simultaneously across the width and depth of the battle space. Operationally, if you look at Vicksburg, no one's ever done an operational level of war better than him. At the tactical level, absolutely brilliant. How he wrote his orders, just sublime. And then he was calm, imperturbable. And when the stakes were highest, he was the best. So when I put that Army blue uniform on, and I did it quite often when I was at West Point, who would I think about of wearing that Army blue uniform? And I used to take his 4-star uniform out and show it to my classes, because we have it in the West Point museum. And I would tell my cadets, you were looking at the uniform of the finest soldier ever to wear Army blue. And I get chills just thinking about him and about whether it's the statue of what we've named after him, about being able to talk to this fine audience, because he was just an amazing soldier.
Lick him tomorrow. I'm going to fight it out all summer.
Lick him tomorrow. That's the best, sir. That's the best.
It is the best. Dana, do you share Ty's assessment of Grant, given that you were a cadet at a time when Lee was still seen as the great battle captain of the Civil War, not Grant?
Well, again, I didn't see Lee as the great battle captain, like many did at that time. Obviously, I have great respect for Ulysses S. Grant. Like I said, since I was a child, so it's really almost my entire life from 9 years old on. America has been blessed, though, of having people, men and women, but people at the right time when America needed them. George Washington during the Revolutionary War, even Winfield Scott during the Mexican expedition, the Mexican War, John J. Pershing, World War I, Eisenhower, Bradley, Marshall. We can even talk modern days Iraq, Petraeus, as examples. So I don't know if I would put Grant higher than everyone, because he was the right person at that time. Tactically, yes, Shiloh, Fort Donelson, especially at the operational level, as Ty just mentioned, Vicksburg, the Vicksburg campaign. I really liked, though, the campaign of 1864 and its strategic campaign. It was operationally strategic, where we had, I believe it was 5 different armies converging on the South, where the South would have no choice. And then he put himself behind one of the armies, Army of the Potomac, with General Meade, and took Lee on directly. So masterful. So I would rank him as one of our great captains. But I don't know if I'd put him up higher than everyone else, because there were times when America has called for leadership and someone has met that call. And in that case, it was Ulysses S. Grant.
This audience has heard me before state and challenge the audience, actually, to produce any other U.S. Army general who in combat was brilliant tactically, operationally, and strategically. Now, let's be honest, very few get to be tactical, operational, and strategic in combat, although there have been some in more recent times and certainly over the years. But he is the only one. And that truly is extraordinary. Beyond that, and there's been some great book titles. I loved Ron White's American Ulysses. Of course, we interviewed him a few years back. But at the end of the day, the Professor Brand's title, "The Man Who Saved the Union," really does capture it. Because at the end of the day, there might not have been a union if Grant had been as incapable as every one of the other Union generals who had been tried in that position, McClellan twice. And of course, it was McClellan running against Lincoln in the 1864 election, which could have been close. And McClellan would have sued for peace. We would not have the Union we had today. That election was decided because of battlefield victories that were the result of the strategy, the overarching strategy that you described, Dana, of everyone converging. Most significantly, of course, Sherman taking Atlanta, and then Sheridan sealing it with the victory in the valley, in the Shenandoah Valley, within less than a month prior to the election. He did save the Union at the end of the day. Ty, let's bring the conversation up to date just a bit. We know that the effects of the Civil War never really went away. Your book establishes that very effectively. You quote the noted historian David Blight, who wrote that the Civil War is the sleeping dragon of American history, ever ready to rise up and breathe fire. Now, the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act that became law a few months ago over the president's veto, I might add, created a commission to rename the posts that honor Confederates within the next 3 years. What are the big ideas that you believe should guide the members of the commission, which now serendipitously include you? How fitting.
It's the great honor of my life to be able to serve on this commission again. And I, at the beginning of our first meeting, I raised my right hand and took the oath of office again, never thinking that I would ever take that oath again. And it was so meaningful to me to be able to do it on a subject of which I care and am so passionate about. The commission we're already been told what to do. We're going to change. That's what the National Defense Authorization Act said, was to rename them. But I do think that there are some things that we should think about, which is that we should make sure that that who we honor represents the values of America. And I'll go back to that. Who we commemorate should represent who we think represents our values of today. And I think the three of us, if you gave us an hour, we could come up not just with 11 names of who we needed to rename, but then give us another hour and we come up with another 11 and another 11 and another 11, and we could go on all day with that. I am so heartened by the fact that so many Americans are now behind this process, to include a supermajority of both the House and the Senate. So I am incredibly thankful and honored to be a part of this process.
If I could just suggest briefly, since I can lobby you here right now in real time, it might be very valuable, I think, to try to link the name to the units on the post. Needless to say, if the unit looks at that front gate and recalls that this was the commander, again, let's say of the 82nd Airborne Division and the 18th Airborne Corps in combat, and went on to have 4 stars and be Chief of Staff and the Supreme Allied Commander and turn a war around in Korea, Ridgway, of course. And again, there could be many others for Fort Bragg as well, including Shugart Gordon, who both earned the Medal of Honor in the Battle of Mogadishu, units on that post. It seems to me that having, again, someone linked to the units on the post, ideally actually served on that post themselves, and then would inspire the soldiers on that post to be all that they can be, and also unify the soldiers on that post, keeping in mind, for example, that Fort Bragg, named for a failed Confederate general who didn't even make it throughout the war. He was fired in 1863, I believe. Fort Braxton Bragg's name is on the home of the Airborne and Special Operations Forces post. And that post is 20% or thereabouts, 15 to 20% African American. So again, I think that the unifying feature is an element that should be present in addition to an inspirational feature, and a possible one that actually obviously has the values, represents the values, lived those values, and then also, again, will be linked to that and inspire those who are serving on that order, on that installation. Let me bring it up again to the present time, because Dana, we all saw very disturbing images on January 6th when essentially insurrectionists stormed Capitol Hill and brought the Confederate flag into the Capitol building. What were your thoughts about that and about the violence in Washington on that day?
I found it unbelievable, first of all. But then again, if people are egged on by, again, a myth, a lie of the election, by a president, in some ways, what do you expect? Seeing the Confederate flag flying inside of the Capitol and going up the Capitol steps, again, for me, my entire life, that flag represented evil, represented just like Nazi Germany, the equivalent of that, as far as I was concerned. But seeing that in our Capitol was horrific. And so many people like myself, other people of color, we also instinctively knew that if it had been Black Lives Matter or people of color, there would have been a lot of violence. There would have been shooting. And so the emotions are mixed in that regard. I don't know if it's, I'll almost say white privilege, that nothing was really done and they were allowed into our nation's capital in an insurrection. So I would hope that we will not see that again, but seeing the Confederate flag inside the Capitol Rotunda is absolutely criminal, and we should never see that again.
I'm going to shift now to some questions, some more questions that were submitted prior by audience members. And Ty, this one's for you. Your first writings on the Civil War actually focused on monuments, again, especially at West Point. You've been to the Grant Monument in New York City, which this great organization helped restore. How does the iconography strike you?
Well, that was a great question. When I first come in there, I see all the iconography of the Union, of the United States, whether it's the shield or the eagle or stuff about Grant. So it's absolutely perfect. It's Horace Porter, West Point graduate, that was really in charge of putting that up, got it across the finish line. But then as I go in, I was struck, I was amazed, a little bit horrified to go in and see the mosaics that are there. And these mosaics are huge, 20, 30 feet. I think they're mosaics, maybe they're paintings. But the one you see initially on there is of Grant about to shake hands with Lee. And to me, it showed Grant and Lee on equal footing in Grant's tomb, which I thought was, I couldn't believe it. And of course, then I did the research on it. When was it put there? 1965, 1966. It was put there at the centennial of the American Civil War, and it shows that lost cause, that the war was really a brother against brother, Blue Gray, Billy Yank, Johnny Reb, and Grant and Lee, but it showed them as equals in that hallowed ground. And I think it's a way of saying of how influential the lost cause was, that it even made its way in my opinion, into Grant's tomb with that mosaic of Lee and Grant shaking hands.
Two final questions. Dana, the first one for you. Lee's name was added to Washington College to transform it from an obscure bankrupt college to a nationally respected institution. And in fact, it became just that. Ty has said that he would support removing Lee's name from his alma mater. Should Washington's name be removed too, given that he also owned slaves?
Well, I certainly agree that Lee's name should be removed. Washington, George Washington was a founder, one of our founding fathers. And once we all understand history, our nation was founded by flawed men. We have that, flawed Caucasian men who were landowners. But that shouldn't take away from what America has become and the ideal of America that we aspire to be. So I would not remove George Washington's name. Robert E. Lee was a traitor. Robert E. Lee rebelled against our nation. Robert E. Lee fought against the United States Army, an army that he had taken an oath to serve, or the Constitution to serve. So there is a stark difference between the two on that. And I've always believed that even with our nation's flaws, America is worth serving. That's why I served for 34 years, Ty for 36 years. And America, to so much of the world, is this beacon of hope. And we're not perfect in any way, but we have an ideal that we're aspiring to be. And that is a better America, I'll say every day, every week. So I hope that we can bridge the gaps we have right now, this racial divide in our country that seems in some ways to be tearing it apart. And I know we can. We can because we have forums like this where we can talk. And we have people, right-minded people, who can cross the line, the aisle, and just because someone differs in opinion with you doesn't mean you vilify them. America will get through this. But to your original question, I do believe Washington's name should remain.
I agree. And context matters as well. And by the way, a spirit of reconciliation matters as well. And some of that took place, of course, was animated by that in various ways by various quarters, although clearly by no means all of it. And some of that undoubtedly was taken advantage of as well. Well, the final question, Ty, goes to you. You'll recall that back in 1976, for the nation's bicentennial, Congress passed legislation posthumously promoting George Washington to the rank of General of the Armies of the United States, effective July 4th, 1776. With the bicentennial of Grant's birthday coming up next year, what do you think of the Grant Monument Association proposal for a measure promoting Grant to that rank, General of the Armies, effective the date of Lee's surrender at Appomattox, April 9th, 1865?
Well, I know my audience. And I know the right answer to this question, but I believe it is absolutely yes. Remember that the reason that Washington was put there, we have another general of the armies, and that's John J. Pershing. In fact, during World War I, Pershing wore 4 gold stars. That was the sign of a general of the armies, was 4 gold stars. It became 5 silver stars during World War II, but they made sure that the ones who were in World War II, that Pershing, who was still alive in World War II, had date of rank. And so when they went to make general of the armies for Washington, it was because Pershing was already there. So should Grant be at the same level as Pershing and Washington? 110%. Sign me up. Put my name on the on whatever petition you need. Absolutely.
You heard it here first. The head of the history department at West Point, emeritus. With that, thanks very much to each of you for helping to explore a very timely and important subject this evening, one that I hope actually enriches the understanding of this audience for the context over the years that played such an important role in degrading the reputation, bringing down the reputation of Ulysses S. Grant after the adulation that characterized the first decades after he saved the Union, served as president, passed away, and the Grant Monument was erected. It's very important, I think, to understand this context, and I deeply appreciate both of you for helping us to achieve that understanding. Dana, I want to thank you in particular for your reflections and forthright insights. Our country has been very fortunate to have you contributing to the significant ongoing discussion on race and racism in America after an extraordinary career in uniform. And Ty, congratulations again on the publication of a truly exceptional and truly important and timely book. In fact, I want to conclude this evening's event with one of your key observations. To create a more just society, you write, we must start by studying our past. If we want to know where to go, we must know where we've been. I could not agree more, and I want you to know that it has been a true privilege to discuss your courageous and thought-provoking book with you and with Dana this evening as part of this year's observation of Grant's birthday. Thank you each for that, and thanks to all of you for joining us virtually this evening.